Hello, and welcome to History 300, the origins of the First World War. Lecture 4, Tour of the Balkans in 1914. In the last lecture, we took a stroll across the whole of the European continent to look at the 6 great powers as they existed in 1914. Now we need to focus in a little more specifically on Southeastern Europe, the region bordered by the Adriatic and Ionian Seas to the west and south, the Black Sea to the east, and the Danube River to the north, the region known as the Balkans. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the verb balkanize as to divide a region into a number of smaller, often mutually hostile political or territorial units. To balkanize somewhere is to leave it a fractured and unhappy place. And indeed, the real Balkans in 1914 were the most unstable and violent region in all of Europe. Wars were breaking out constantly. Frontiers were changing every year. New states were emerging all the time. To apply a geological metaphor, the Balkans were the San Andreas Fault of Europe. They were the place at which several major ethnic, religious, cultural, and linguistic frontiers all crashed into one another, and the effect was ferocious, unpredictable, and dangerous. In 1878, the first Chancellor and founder of the German Empire, Otto von Bismarck, had been asked if there would ever be another war between the great powers. "Europe today," he said, "is a powder keg, and the leaders are like men smoking in an arsenal. A single spark will set off an explosion that will consume us all. I cannot tell you when that explosion will occur, but I can tell you where. Some damn foolish thing in the Balkans will set it off." 36 years later, his prediction proved to be exactly right. The Balkans had not always been such an unstable region. Indeed, for several hundred years, right up to the mid-19th century, little of any great note happened there. That was because during that period, most of the Balkans were under the control of Ottoman Turkey, a Muslim empire which had conquered the region during the 15th century. At the height of their powers, the Ottoman sultans controlled not just the Balkans, but the whole of the North African coastline and most of what is today the Middle East. Most of the people of the Balkans were not Muslims, but rather a mixture of Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians. But during the long years in which the Turks dominated the region, they had little choice but to accept the overlordship of their Ottoman rulers. This began to change, however, in the early 19th century, as Ottoman power began to visibly wane. There was a slow but inexorable retreat of the Ottoman frontier southeastwards, back towards their imperial capital, Constantinople, as the Turks lost control of one and then another of their Balkan vassals. As the 19th century progressed, it became increasingly obvious to everyone that the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. But what would replace it? The problem was known as the Eastern Question, and it came to dominate much of the politics of the 19th century. Some of the great powers, such as Austria and Russia, jockeyed with one another to exploit Ottoman weakness and seize control of as much Balkan territory as possible. Others, like Britain and France, tried to artificially extend the life of the Ottoman Empire, to delay its fall, so as to deny their rivals any of the Turkish territory. In the midst of this great power Cold War, small successor states appeared across the Balkans, seeking patronage, land, and in some cases, revenge. It was a volatile mixture. We should begin then with the Ottomans, who by 1914 had been expelled almost entirely from the European side of the Turkish Straits, and now controlled only a small sliver of land in the Balkans called Eastern Thrace. Aside from defeat in several wars with its former Balkan vassals, the most significant thing that had recently happened to the Ottoman Empire was the so-called Young Turk Revolution of 1908. This was a palace coup d'etat led by a group of young army officers who sought to reverse the empire's long-term decline by modernizing its political and military institutions. The Young Turks were in many respects the founding fathers of the modern nation-state of Turkey, which emerged after the First World War. But the immediate effect of their actions in 1908 was to tempt the Austrians into seizing the Ottoman provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the region where Archduke Franz Ferdinand would be assassinated 6 years later. Moving northwards and westwards from Thrace, we encounter a number of small states which had achieved independence from the Turks. Greece, which had become independent in 1830, Romania, which achieved this in 1862, Serbia, independent since 1878, Bulgaria, which assumed its modern form in 1908, Little Montenegro, which became a kingdom in 1910, and Albania, the newest of the Balkan states, which in June 1914 had only existed for less than a year. The Balkan states were all united in their desire to push back the Turks, but they agreed on precious little else. Indeed, the territorial disputes that took place between them were almost as bitterly fought as their wars against the Ottomans. In 1912, for instance, Bulgaria had fought alongside Greece, Serbia and Montenegro in order to expel the Turks from the provinces of Macedonia and Thrace. But almost as soon as the war was victoriously concluded, the Bulgarians turned around and attacked the Greeks and Serbs. This attempt to backstab their former allies went badly for the Bulgarians, and in the final peace treaty drawn up in 1913, the frontiers of the Balkan states assumed the form that they held at the time of Franz Ferdinand's assassination. The big winner from the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 turned out to be the Kingdom of Serbia, with its capital in Belgrade. And since Serbia is going to be one of the central players in the July crisis, I'm going to devote the rest of this lecture to talking about it. As I mentioned earlier, Serbia had come into independent existence in 1878, and thanks to its military victories, it had more than doubled in size since its initial creation. Although nominally it was a constitutional parliamentary monarchy on the Western European model, Serbia's internal politics in practice were fractious and extremely violent. Its first king abdicated in mysterious circumstances in 1889 in favour of his 12-year-old son Alexander, but then the old king intrigued so much that the new king eventually had to pack him off to foreign exile. Alexander himself was then brutally murdered, along with his wife, in a military coup in 1903, led by a group of army officers who were unhappy with the king's political meddling. It was an extraordinarily gruesome event, even by Balkan standards, with the bodies of the royal couple hacked to pieces and thrown out of a royal palace window into a manure heap. A royal claimant from a rival dynasty was then declared the new monarch, and he, rather sensibly under the circumstances, decided to keep out of political matters entirely. Incidentally, this new king's son later had to renounce his claim to the throne after he kicked one of his servants to death. Charming bunch of people, yes? The assassins of Alexander I were not only not punished for the crime of regicide, but one of them, Dragutin Dimitrijević, was heralded as the saviour of the fatherland by the Serbian parliament, and later promoted to head of Serbian military intelligence. Dimitrijević is going to be an important figure in our story, because under his codename of Apis, he was the leader of a secret ultranationalist group known as the Black Hand, which in 1914 organised the assassination attempt against Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The diplomatic question which dominated Serbian politics by 1914 was that of its relationship with its northern neighbour Austria-Hungary. During the early years of the Serbian kingdom, when it still regarded Ottoman Turkey as the main threat to its existence, Serbia was on fairly good terms with Austria. However, as the Ottoman danger receded, Austria began to appear less as a protector and more as a rival. The main issue was the status of the large number of ethnic Serbs who lived within the boundaries of Austria-Hungary itself. The government in Belgrade ultimately wished to unite all Serbian-speaking peoples within a greater Serbian state. Indeed, the ambitions of some Serbs were even greater than that, and they wanted to absorb not merely the Serbian speakers of the Balkans, but all of the so-called Southern Slav peoples, such as the Croats, the Slovenes, the Macedonians, and the Montenegrins, into a single polity that would be known as Yugoslavia. Achieving either of these goals would, however, mean detaching a significant amount of territory from Austria-Hungary. And needless to say, the imperial government in Vienna saw the Greater Serbian and Yugoslavian projects as a threat to its very existence. Nationalist agitation directed by Belgrade towards the Serbs living in Austria-Hungary was stirring up exactly the kind of ethnic strife that the empire was so afraid of. By 1914, then, relations between Austria and Serbia were extremely tense, so much so that the Serbians feared, with good reason, that Austria might be planning to launch a preemptive war against them to rid themselves of the Serbian menace once and for all. To defend against this, they sought protection from Russia, which regarded itself as the ancestral patron and defender of all of the southern Slavs. If Austria-Hungary ever decided to take military action against Serbia then, it would be running the risk of a confrontation with its own massive neighbour to the east. The Russo-Serbian Compact was only one of the many formal and informal alliance relationships that existed in Europe in 1914, however. So in the next lecture, we'll examine more broadly the alliance system as it stood on the eve of the First World War. See you then.